Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, Farm, Food, and the Policies and Practices Behind America's Dietary Health. We are glad to have the opportunity to engage with you today and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Martha King, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Projects for Farm Foundation, located just outside Chicago, Illinois. I'm excited to hear from our panel of authors as they discuss the possible links between agricultural policy and issues like food security and nutrition. Before we get into today's program, I'm going to take just a few moments to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out and to explore a collaboration. Now, I'd like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you will not only be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you will also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends. The link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms. If you are posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you please use #FarmFoundationForum. And here are our last few housekeeping notes. There will be an audience question and answer section at the end. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, to queue questions. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we'll send out that link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you will receive a link to a brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing the survey. Now let's turn to today's forum topic. We have an outstanding panel of experts with a diversity of perspectives who are going to be able to really dive into the conversation around the food we put on our plates. This includes consumer behavior, societal issues, food policies, as well as farming policies and practices. Farm Foundation aims to serve as a neutral ground where all voices can be heard, and we strongly encourage the audience to use the Q&A button throughout the presentation to queue up your questions for today. With everyone's contributions, it is sure to be a rich discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator and discussion leader, G. William Hoagland. William is a Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he helps direct and manage fiscal, health, and economic policy analyses. Before joining BPC, William served as Vice President of Public Policy for Cigna Corporation, and prior to that, he completed 33 years of federal government service, including 25 years on the U.S. Senate staff. Among his many appointments that are too numerous to mention here, Bill is an affiliate professor of public policy at George Mason University. And in 1981, he served as the administrator of the Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service and as a special assistant to the Secretary of Agriculture. Bill, we are so pleased to have you as our moderator today. I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Martha, and thank you to the Farm Foundation for holding this very important discussion. One small item I should mention, Martha, is the fact that I grew up on a family farm in Indiana that has continued to remain in the family for over 100 years, thus qualifying it as a Hoosier homestead. And also, I'll come back to this in a moment here, but my undergraduate degree was in ag econ at Purdue. As Martha said, I am currently with the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Bipartisanship is not an oxymoron for us. The founders of the center, the late Senators Bob Dole and Howard Baker on the Republican side, and George Mitchell and Tom Daschle on the Democratic side, they truly believed, and we truly believe, that sustainable policy is best achieved when it is done in a bipartisan way. And historically, it has been, farm policy in this country has been done with broad bipartisan buy-in. But it's clear this is a highly polarized political environment that we are experiencing today. And it's not exactly clear how the 2023 Farm Bill will fare in this environment. There are many interacting issues that will be brought to the surface as we enter the debate next year, from conservation to climate to energy to commodity support to trade and, yes, nutrition and diet. First, you should know that the 2023 Farm Bill will likely be the first farm bill in our country's history which will top $1 trillion. And second, you should know that nearly 80% of that bill funding will be directed toward the nutrition title. Also, you should probably be aware, if you're not already, that the President Biden just last week announced that we will have a White House conference on food, nutrition, health, and hunger this September. And this will be the first such White House conference since President Nixon's White House conference in 1969 on that same subject. And that resulted in a number of major federal policies impacting diet and federal food programs. And so that brings me back to Purdue in 1969. In my senior year at Purdue, I had a course entitled American Farm Policy. The professor of that course was a Dr. Don Parlberg. And I just still happen to have the book he wrote then, and from which was the course directed. And I want to quote from it. He said, in discussions about diets, it is well to remember that the tongue does the talking as well as the tasting. But the tongue is far more influential in the determinants of food policy than the digestive tract. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Robert Parlberg, the son of my professor, Don Parlberg, and a distinguished award-winning author in his own right, who we'll hear about that he just had published and receiving an award for, Resetting the Table. Robert is an adjunct professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and an associate at Harvard's Weatherhead Center. He has been a member of the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Research Council, a member of the Board of Directors of Windrock International, and a consultant to the International Food Policy Research Institute and the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's also had been with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And as I said, he is the recent author of other books, Starved for Science, Food Politics, and United States of Excess. I turn it over to you, Dr. Parlberg.
Well, thanks very much, Bill, for that fun memory of my dad and my dad's book. And thanks to the Farm Foundation for bringing me into this interesting panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be sharing a message from my new book, which is titled Resetting the Table, Straight Talk About the Food We Grow and Eat. It's a message that's directed at farm organizations and at agribusiness companies. And it may sound a little bit harsh, but that's why the subtitle of my book is called Straight Talk. My advice to farm and agribusiness organizations is to, frankly, stop bragging about the fact that America's food system is the safest, the most abundant, and the most affordable in the world. That's all true. But this kind of talk today falls flat in places like New York and San Francisco and Boston, where I live, because our current food system is producing too many unhealthy results. Too much of the food sold in supermarkets and at restaurants is bad for our health. And if farmers and agribusiness companies don't start showing more concern, they're going to be blamed for this result. In fact, to an extent, they already are. So I have a first slide here that looks at the dietary health crisis in America, the dimensions of that crisis. And You can see only 1 in 10 Americans consumes the recommended minimum daily servings of fruit and vegetables. We consume too much meat, 20 to 60% above dietary guidelines. Too much ultra-processed food with added sugar, salt, and fat. And one conspicuous result of all this is that 42% of adults in the United States today are clinically obese. And that is, that's not just a high number, that's 3 times the share from the 1960s. Obesity now contributes to 30,000 deaths every year from diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancers. Next slide. Here are the recent obesity trends over the last 20 years, up from 30.5% to 42.4% of American adults. And that was before COVID. In one 2021 study from the CDC of adults and children, we learned that the rate of body mass index increase during the pandemic doubled the rate that was in effect pre-pandemic. So we know that COVID put obese Americans at a much higher health risk, but we're going to learn when the pandemic finally ends that it also contributed to a much larger number of obese Americans. Next slide now. Now, my warning to farm and agribusiness groups is that this dietary health crisis is increasingly blamed on farms, on what American farms grow. For example, here's a quote from Michael Pollan, who is the single most influential journalist covering America's food system ever since his 2006 bestseller, Omnivore's Dilemma. Pollan says, we create incentives for farmers to grow huge quantities of corn and soy, mostly in the Midwest. Corn and soy is really where the calories in most of the junk food come from. We have inadvertently created a system where the cheapest calories in the supermarket are the least healthy. Pollan has popularized this notion that America's bad diet comes from the excessive quantities of corn and soy that are, he says, promoted by farm subsidies in the United States. Most of my students out in the East Coast believe this. This is for them the gospel. They know that farm subsidies promote the production of unhealthy foods on America's farms, and that they say we're living under a plague of cheap corn, and that's the reason our diet is in trouble. But let's next slide. Let's take a look at this assertion. The agricultural economists that I talk to know that this is completely untrue. The purpose of farm subsidies is not to boost food supplies in the market and make food cheap. It's to boost the income of farmers, usually by reducing supplies in the market, which drives up the price of food. We use import restrictions. We use land set-asides. We mandate more non-food use of farm commodities. We make food expensive, not cheap. Now, Michael Pollan came to believe that our farm policies make food cheap after talking to some populist farm movement leaders who've always wanted to return to the more extreme supply control policies of the 1950s. And anything less than this, they consider to be a cheap food policy. It's not a cheap food policy. It's just a slightly less expensive food policy. Next slide. The policies of the federal government today make the price of all of these products artificially high, not artificially low. We have tariff rate quotas on sugar imports that keep the price of sugar in the US market 65% above the world market price. We have a conservation reserve program that allows wheat growers in Kansas to take their land out of production for 10 years at a time, pushing up the price of wheat while they get rental payments for that idled land. For corn, we don't have a plague of cheap corn. We have a renewable fuel standard for ethanol that diverts nearly a third of our corn crop out of the food supply completely for use in producing auto fuel. This This pushes the price of corn up by about 30%, and crops that are grown on the same land as corn, like soybeans, price of those crops goes up by about 20%. As for meat, well, because corn and soy are animal feeds and because they're artificially expensive, the price of meat is artificially high as well. Same for dairy. Feed costs drive up dairy prices. We also have federal milk marketing orders for dairy that stabilize prices, but usually in an upward direction. Okay, and now, so artificially cheap, unhealthy food is not the problem. And the low availability of healthy food is not the problem either. In fact, as our dietary health crisis was worsening after 1970, fresh fruit and vegetable availability per capita was increasing. Even when adjusted for spoilage and plate waste, fresh fruit per capita availability up by 40%, vegetable availability up 21%, per capita availability of broccoli increased 13-fold. Much of this increased availability was made possible by imports, including from tropical countries and also off-season imports from Southern Hemisphere countries. We import 1/3 of our fruit consumption, 1/3 of our vegetable consumption, 1/2 of our fruit consumption, and 80% of our seafood consumption, of course. If these imports weren't there, our nation's dietary health crisis would be even worse. Next slide. Now, some try to explain America's dietary health problem by claiming that healthy foods are more expensive than unhealthy foods, but that's not true either. If you look at the period from 1980 to 2006, USDA study shows that average retail prices for healthy foods fell at the same rate as for calorie-dense foods. Once you adjust for inflation and once you adjust for quality, processing, and seasonality. If you look at the next slide, at apples on the left and chocolate chip cookies on the right, you can see that the price was, the average annual change in prices was showing almost an identical trend. But there's another argument. Next slide, please. Another argument out there that some Americans, especially poor inner city Americans, don't have a healthy diet because they lack physical access to the supermarkets that sell fresh fruits and vegetables. They live in what are called food deserts. This is a politically appealing argument because you don't have to blame the poor for their poor diet. It doesn't blame food companies or supermarkets either. That's politically convenient. It says we just need more supermarkets, mostly in poor neighborhoods. This is a popular argument, but the latest research shows that it's not a particularly reliable one. Next slide, please. A couple of studies, 2011 study actually found no connection between grocery store access and healthful diets. A 2014 study found that low-income Americans actually enjoy closer proximity to supermarkets than Americans who are not so poor. Other studies have looked at what happens to diets when new supermarkets arrive in a community, and we learn that diets don't change much. It's because supermarkets sell junk food along with healthy food. They often make choosing an unhealthy diet more convenient and more affordable. Next slide. So the real problem isn't food deserts, it's what are called food swamps. If we define a food swamp as a neighborhood with at least 4 times as many fast food restaurants and convenience stores compared to supermarkets and grocery stores, these food swamps are a stronger prediction of obesity than food deserts. And in fact, if you control for food swamps, the influence of food deserts disappears. It falls to zero. Next slide. And here's the unfortunate part. Supermarkets are actually a part of the swamp. As I hinted already, they have packaged foods that are mostly unhealthy to consume. One Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study found that only 30% of food company product offerings can be judged healthy. A Parker Pope study in 2019, added sugars were found in nearly 70% of packaged foods, including breads, yogurt, sauces, and even health foods. A 2019 Northwestern study found almost 9 out of 10 packaged food products are ultra processed. And that's a problem because, one recent study showed that if you give 2 different groups exactly the same foods, but one gets those foods in a minimally processed form, the other gets them in an ultra processed form, those getting the ultra processed form will consume on average 508 additional calories a day. That's mostly because it's not because the food tastes better. They don't report that it tastes better. They eat faster, and they eat so fast that their body doesn't have time to tell the mouth that it's full. Next slide. Now, it's not just supermarkets that are a part of the food swamp. Department stores and pharmacies are also a part of this problem of being surrounded by unhealthy food all day long. If I go to my local Target store, it has a grocery section with 13 different categories of chips, snacks, and cookies. If I go to my local CVS pharmacy, I took this picture at my local CVS pharmacy. This is the candy aisle in my pharmacy. In order to get to the prescription counter in the back, I have to go through aisles filled with candy, cookies, soda, sugary breakfast cereals. So in a single visit, I can try to protect my health and ruin my health at the same time. So next slide. So the question is, who created this food swamp that's ruining our diet? The food manufacturing companies and the restaurant chains say they're not to blame. They're only giving us what we want. We put the food in our own mouths. They don't put a gun to our head. They say that unhealthy eating is a matter of personal responsibility. But stop and think about that. Remember that obesity rates have tripled since the 1960s. Is that because personal irresponsibility has tripled? I don't think so. I think there's a much better explanation, and that's the work that food companies and restaurant chains do to intentionally design products that will be irresistible, virtually addictive, and often unhealthy. Food companies and restaurant chains design foods with too much added sugar, salt, and fat. They design foods to be ultra processed. These are foods with just the right combination of textures and ingredients to hit a bliss point inside our mouth that gives us a dopamine high. That triggers the reward circuit in our brain and teaches us to crave these foods even when we're not hungry. Then, of course, the same companies advertise these foods. They advertise these unhealthy foods, including to children. So notice what I'm saying. Our unhealthy eating does not come from farms. It does not even come from farm subsidies. It doesn't come from food deserts. It doesn't come from healthy food that's too expensive. It largely comes from what food companies do to farm commodities after they leave the farm. Farm organizations and agribusiness companies are being blamed for our poor dietary health, when the real troublemakers are food manufacturing companies. So next slide. This leads me to offer in the end some practical political advice to farm organizations and agribusiness companies. I think it's time to loosen your traditional political alliance with food companies. They may be your customer, but they're engaging in practices that put your reputation now at risk. In my book, I describe a moment at the 2018 Farm Bureau convention in Nashville, where one of the featured speakers was the head of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. It's the leading lobby for food manufacturing companies. This person tried to wrap herself in the virtue blanket of American farming. She said, there were farmers in the audience, of course. She said, "I'm the link between you and the American consumer. We are working together to tell the story of American agriculture." Well, the farmers in the audience should have said, "Hey, wait a minute. I'm not sure that I want my story told by food companies that turn my healthy harvest into Twinkies and Doritos." So my advice is to be wary of the food company embrace and do things that will separate your reputation from the unhealthy foods that they design and sell. You should be building your reputation by reaching out to the public health community and to the medical community. For example, in the upcoming 2023 Farm Bill debate, you should reach out and lend your support to the American Heart Association, which has called for pilot studies to learn what a soda restriction in the SNAP program, the food stamp program, might do to improve public health. You should join with organizations like Healthy Food America and Healthy Eating Research in calling for the food and beverage industry to strengthen its voluntary industry code that limits food advertisements to children. And you should be joining with the American Medical Association, pushing the Food and Drug Administration to develop a stronger front of package nutrition labeling standard to give shoppers at a glance guidance on the products that might be filled with too much added sugar, salt, and fat. In retrospect, I think farm and agribusiness organizations missed an opportunity a decade ago when they decided not to support Michelle Obama's popular Let's Move initiative to slow childhood obesity. The public support for that initiative would have increased your credibility dramatically in the public health community. It would have cost nothing, and you wouldn't have had to change how you farm. If farm organizations start showing more concern about America's dietary health crisis today, it's going to be harder for critics to blame you for that crisis, which is what they're doing. Okay, next slide. Let me just mention that the argument I'm making is only one small part of my new book, Resetting the Table. I also have chapters on farm animal welfare, GMOs, robotics, local food, organic food. So if you're interested in a wider range of my views, the book is there. In fact, it's out in paperback now. And to anticipate and share some good news, it will be officially announced next week that the book won a Gold Seal Award from the Nautilus Book Award organization, which selected it as a winner in the green and sustainability category. So last slide. There's my gold seal. And I've said enough for now. I look forward to the Q&A session and the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert. Just a couple of quick comments. Number one, in his book, he talks, as Robert talked about it, the food swamps. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and I noted in his book that the third largest grocery retailer in this region is not Giant or Safeway or Costco, but is CVS Pharmacy with 133 stores in the District of Columbia alone. Important. A second thing I would note also is just to put an exclamation mark on this. We do a lot of work here at BPC on health and its relationship to diet. And of that obesity issue costs us in the healthcare system nearly $250 billion a year. We're concerned about healthcare costs escalating. This would be one of the areas that obviously that we should focus on as Robert has outlined. Congratulations on your award. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Michael Jacobson. He is the co-founder of the Center for Science in Public Interest, a nonprofit health advocacy organization. He was the longtime executive director and is now senior scientist at CSPI. Michael has led that organization's campaigns on sugar drinks, salt, trans fat, and several food additives. Among the many books he has authored are Salt Wars and Liquid Candy. He received the 2010 Hero Award from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention Foundation and the American Public Health Association's 2011 David P. Rawl Award for Advocacy in Public Health. His doctorate is in microbiology from MIT. Michael, welcome aboard, and I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and thank you to the Farm Foundation for inviting me to this forum. One little correction, I'm no longer a senior scientist at CSPI. I'm now independent, but I will always be the co-founder of that wonderful consumer advocacy organization. And it's a privilege to participate in this session along with Rob Parlberg. And I've shared with him some of the pain in seeing misuse of science, distortion of scientific evidence on such issues as farm policies, GMOs, and some other things. I think this is a timely topic to discuss, especially because of the Farm Bill coming up, but it's been timely for several decades as Americans' diet has deteriorated. The diet-related diseases, as Dr. Parlberg mentioned, are an extraordinary burden to the American public, and it's kind of invisible. We don't associate foods with disease because usually the disease comes only after decades of consuming a certain kind of diet. The question that this forum really raises is how could we improve Americans' health through new food and farm policies? And I suggest that the question is a very easy one to answer. People have known about improved policies for decades. The real challenge is implementing those policies, getting the government to adopt such policies, and farm organizations, agribusiness, and the food industry could play a major role in getting these better policies adopted. Could you show the first slide, please? And this really reiterates what Dr. Parlberg was saying before, the connection between the foods we eat and the health problems that result. If we consumed less sugar drinks, less processed foods, we would lower rates of obesity, prevent diabetes, and reduce the number of other health problems. The American Heart Association has urged Americans, the dietary guidelines for Americans has urged the public to cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol, mostly from meat and dairy products and egg yolks, to help prevent heart attacks and strokes. We ought to be eating less salt to prevent heart attacks and strokes. We ought to be eating less processed meat and alcohol. Alcohol contributes to cancers of the mouth, throat, breast, liver, and colon. Processed meats like hot dogs and bacon, ham, contribute to cancer of the colon. Obesity, I should mention, contributes to 13 different kinds of cancer, from breast to colon to uterus and a whole bunch of others. And we ought to be eating more whole grains, beans, and vegetables to help lower our weight and lower blood cholesterol. And it's going to take more than public service announcements, newspaper articles, occasional TV shows to achieve these dietary changes. Education, as has been demonstrated over the decades, is a very, very weak measure. We need to get policy changes. And sometimes we do get those changes. And I'd like to start with just a bit of good news. And that is that the problem of partially hydrogenated vegetable oil has been solved. That's the source of trans fat. Trans fat was a very significant contributor to heart disease. Harvard researchers estimated that because we were eating the partially hydrogenated oil in baked goods, fried foods, a whole bunch of other products, a huge percentage of the food supply, that was causing 50,000 to 100,000 preventable fatal heart attacks annually. And it was a big problem. 8 billion pounds a year of partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, mostly from soybeans, was dumped into the food supply in the cookies and margarine and fast foods every year. And the research, there's been little bits of research going back to the 1950s and 60s suggesting that partially hydrogenated oil was harmful. But it wasn't until the early 1990s, 1992, 93, that demonstrated in clinical studies and epidemiological studies that partially hydrogenated oil was not a safe oil as the American Heart Association and my organization contended, but it was the single most harmful oil in the food supply, worse than the saturated fat in meat and dairy products on a pound for pound basis. And so that was the early 90s. CSPI petitioned the FDA to start restricting partially hydrogenated oil. Denmark actually banned partially hydrogenated oil in the early, around 2003. And the evidence built up higher and higher. Health organizations began crusading against foods made with partially hydrogenated oil. There was a lot of publicity, lawsuits against McDonald's and Kraft for using this product. And it became the butt of jokes on late night television. And finally, the FDA required labeling of trans fat on nutrition facts labels. And that really sent a signal to the food industry that this is bad stuff. And the challenge was replacing it. And that led to a very successful process in which consumers told food companies that they didn't want it. Food companies told oil processors to produce healthier oils, and oil processors told farmers, hey, we'll give you a little money, extra money, if you grow things like high oleic soybeans or canola. And because those oils could replace partially hydrogenated oil very easily. And over several years, farmers came through, produced those different crops that led to greater supplies of healthier oils. And that enabled FDA to ban partially hydrogenated oil in 2018. And funny thing, the food prices didn't change at all. The taste of food didn't change at all. When McDonald's changed from partially hydrogenated oil to healthier oils, they didn't get a single complaint about the taste of food. So that was one of the success stories. And what made it possible was that the change was invisible to consumers. That was an easy one, and it took only about 25 years from the first good research until the ban actually went into effect. and that is saving tens of thousands of lives a year. If you can hold off on the next slide for a moment, Morgan. The much tougher problem has to do with the single most harmful substance in the food supply. Single most harmful substance, worse than partially hydrogenated oil was, and that is salt. Salt is causing as many as 100,000 preventable deaths a year due to heart attacks and strokes. There's been evidence for over 100 years that sodium from sodium chloride contributes to cardiovascular disease. But salt makes foods taste good. People like salty foods. And there is no simple, easy, low-cost substitute that can replace salt in the food supply. There have been admonitions from authoritative agencies to reduce sodium, for the government to do something about sodium, for industry to lower sodium, going back to the 1969 White House Conference on food and nutrition. There hasn't been any change in sodium consumption in decades, notwithstanding all these recommendations, because the government did virtually nothing. Yeah, it's eat less sodium as part of the dietary guidelines for Americans, but it's had no effect whatsoever. Finally, after petitions from CSPI and a lawsuit, in 2016, the FDA proposed voluntary targets for sodium levels in food. That's kind of the first official thing. Unfortunately, those were proposed, not final, proposed voluntary, not mandatory guidelines, even after the Institute of Medicine in 2010 recommended mandatory limits on sodium in different categories of food. But this having at least voluntary, and the FDA finalized some of the voluntary targets last October. And we shall see, they're 2.5-year targets. We'll see what the food industry has done on this voluntary basis. I'm not optimistic about that. But there are two more effective ways to reduce sodium levels in food and prevent these tens of thousands of heart attack deaths, stroke deaths that are being caused every year. One is more influential warning labels. And this is something that I think there are a whole bunch of labels that are being adopted globally. I think the most effective ones were developed first in Chile, and similar ones were then adopted in Mexico, Israel, and a couple of other countries. And those are warning notices, not just for sodium, high sodium foods, but also for foods high in calories, sugar, and saturated fat. And there was a study done several years after the Chilean requirement went into effect. And they found that the number of products that were labeled high in sodium dropped substantially in a number of product categories. Look at a 55% decrease in those high sodium foods, 45% decrease in savory spreads, much smaller decrease in soups that are very salty, and sausages are very salty, a huge decrease in that. Some categories, for some reason, weren't affected at all. But that's, if we were serious about reducing sodium levels, that kind of labeling could have a big effect. A second approach is for the FDA to convert some of its targets, and some of the targets are limits on maximum limits of sodium in foods, and those could be made mandatory. And that would be a relatively easy way of reducing sodium levels. So enough about salt. Let's march on to saturated fat, which has been criticized as a source of heart attacks and strokes for about 50 years, starting with the American Heart Association, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 1980, and World Health Organization, and many others. And there, the challenge is reducing the amount of saturated fat, probably not replacing it, although it could be replaced to some extent by more saturated fats. And let me just, on this slide, I mentioned a couple of approaches that would be very controversial. I think farm organizations would oppose them, but it would be a way to help prevent heart attacks. And one thing would be to encourage feedlots to deliver lower fat cattle to slaughterhouses. And that could be done by, at the slaughterhouse level, fatty cattle would be taxed and the revenues would be given to the feedlot operators who deliver leaner cattle. And there are obvious ways to lower the fat content of cattle, less grain feeding and so on, more grass feeding. And then reducing fat in milk through pricing incentives. If farmers could be persuaded to use methods to lower saturated fat, especially not just the fat content, but saturated fat, they could be rewarded through pricing incentives. And certain breeds of dairy cows have lower fat milk, and if feeding things like canola, which is high in polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fat, that gets incorporated into the milk, and that lowers the saturated fat content, which is the real bugaboo in milk. And that might help revive milk consumption to some extent. And I just want to emphasize here, it's for milk, it's not a matter of educating people to consume low-fat or skim milk, because the milk fat that's removed in producing skim milk would eventually be consumed in the form of cheese or ice cream or some other products. So salt and saturated fat are a couple of areas where we need policies. Let me go on to talking about how do you increase the consumption of healthier foods like fruits and vegetables, and using similar policies to reduce the consumption of those unhealthy ultra-processed foods that Dr. Parlberg was talking about. The SNAP program, food stamps, could be modified to bar their use to purchase sugar drinks. It's an obvious thing. Food stamp users spend billions of dollars a year on sugar drinks that only produce obesity and heart disease and diabetes. And the food stamp program could be modified to give a bonus for fruit and vegetable purchases. And that certainly would increase consumption of fruits and vegetables and be a real subsidy to fruit and vegetable growers. School lunches and breakfasts, thanks to Michelle Obama and certain members of Congress, have been improved greatly in the last 5 years or so, 8 years. And we need further improvements, especially cutting the amount of sugar in school breakfasts, where sugary breakfast cereals and pastries are still widely consumed. Another area where there's been progress is getting healthier foods on government property. where industry can't object because government is in charge. Government can determine what goes into the vending machines, what's served in the cafeterias, what's served in meals, say in prisons. And the CDC and many other government groups have announced policies. Some government agencies have adopted them, others not. But it's an easy way to make progress. Taxing sugary drinks, that would certainly cut consumption of sugar drinks. The United Kingdom has escalating taxes. The higher the sugar content, the greater the tax. That has reduced sugar consumption from sugar drinks by 10%. And many other countries have similar taxes. The US hasn't done that. Seattle, though, has, and they found that a tax of 1 3/4 cents per ounce, that's about 20 cents for a 12-ounce can, led to a 23% decrease in the amount of sugar provided by sugar consumption from those drinks. In Philadelphia, a 1.5 cents per ounce tax reduced consumption among high school students by about 30%. And that money, the revenue generated, can be used for things like preschool education, as it's being done in Philadelphia. The federal government could raise $10 billion in revenue every year from a penny per ounce tax on sugar drinks, and could send the money to the states to let them support social programs, could fund Medicare, and so on. And the last thing is probably the scariest and most problematical thing and most challenging of everything I've mentioned. And that is, some research has indicated that contaminants in the food supply are endocrine disruptors that come from pesticides and plastics and other chemicals. And that some of those endocrine disruptors appear to promote obesity. The scariest studies have been done in mice, where if pregnant mice are fed these obesogenic chemicals, their offspring have obesity. That's bad enough. But even worse is their offspring, who were not fed the chemicals, give birth to obese grandchildren, if you can say, grandchildren of the first mice. And if those chemicals are causing obesity in humans, then I think solving the obesity problem is going to be a multi-generational problem. And the contribution of these chemicals is unknown to obesity, is really unknown now. But if it is causing a high percentage of obesity, limiting the use of these chemicals will do more than all these other things we've talked about. And obviously, Dr. Perlberg showed that increase, the tripling of obesity since roughly 1980. That's been the obesity epidemic. Much of that could have been caused by the chemicals that are getting into our food supply. So let me end my talk now and turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our final speaker, before we go to the audience for Q&A, and feel free to put your questions in that Q&A box down there. We are getting a lot of questions, and some of them are already being answered by the speakers. So please enter your questions as we go forward here. Our final speaker, as I say, is Eve Thurow-Paul. Eve is one of the world's leading experts on millennial and Gen Z global food culture, and founder and executive director of the Food for Climate League. Hungry is her latest book she has authored. Through her writings, consultancy, and nonprofit leadership, she connects the dots between climate, food trends, human needs to develop strategic products and campaigns. Eve views food culture, as I understand, as the key lever for improving mental, physical, and environmental health around the world. With that, Eve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everybody hear and see me? Because I can't see myself. Okay, there we go. This has been supremely interesting. I have lots and lots of notes of things that I hope to cover today with the limited time that we do have. But today I'd like to just infuse into this conversation the role of food culture and really taking into account what our eaters' wants and needs. Yes, the physiological, but also the emotional. So next slide, please. My name is Eve Turow-Paul. I am an author, I'm a researcher, and I'm also the founder and executive director of Food for Climate League. We're a 501c3 nonprofit founded back in 2019 with funding from the Food at Google team. And prior to Food for Climate League, I'd been spending about a decade traveling around the world, talking to people about really their greatest desires, wants, needs, and trying to decipher the why behind today's biggest food and lifestyle trends. Next slide, please. I think I just got ahead of myself. So yes, for the last 10 plus years, I've been really obsessed with this question of what is the why behind today's biggest trends? Oftentimes people will look, especially at millennials, Gen Zers, the younger generations, and roll their eyes. Say, what is it with avocado toast? What is it with matcha oat milk lattes? These kids are so irresponsible. I personally think that no one's going to spend their discretionary time or income on anything that is not in some way contributing to their well-being or that people believe is contributing to their well-being. And so I'm really interested in figuring out, well, what is it that people seem to feel that they're missing, that they see a solution for in these kinds of food trends? And while I'm in general interested in the biggest food and lifestyle trends, it really has been a focus for me of food. And that is because young people today spend a disproportionate amount of their discretionary income and time on food, food media, food culture in general. So just as a few examples here, this is some data that I actually gleaned through a joint study with Data Central called the Hungry Study. We found that 84% of our Gen Z participants and 86% of our millennial participants said that they're passionate about food. Those statistics line up perfectly with statistics from many, many other market research studies. And then there's also just two pictures here from my travels over the last few years. One is a photo of a woman on a train in Bangkok. Her shirt read, "F love, I have food," that I thought was pretty funny. And then the picture on the right here is cold brew, but this is not in New York or Chicago or San Francisco. I was in Yangon, Myanmar, where they had just received internet access. The roads were not paved, but they had cold brew with hints of cola and lemon. So just to show the ubiquity of foodie culture and its influence on global culture. Next slide, please. So the way that I really get to the why behind the way people choose to spend their discretionary time and income is by first taking a step back and evaluating, well, what needs in general motivate human behavior? And many of you are likely familiar already with this pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I have not relied entirely on Maslow, but I spent a great deal of time looking at different well-being theories by folks like Maslow, who are psychologists, psychoanalysts, but also religious leaders, neurobiologists. Next slide, please. And when I layered all of these different theories of really what human beings need to feel well on top of one another, there were these three buckets that appeared. One is that we all have a desire to feel in control and safe. Two is we all have a desire to feel like we belong, that we're a part of a community. And three, we all have a desire for meaning and purpose in our lives. That doesn't mean we all need to feel like we can change the world, but it could mean that we find a sense of meaning and purpose in feeding somebody or giving someone, a bouquet of flowers and making their day. That there's something that we have within our own power that will make change either on one individual or on the world. Next slide, please. And then the next step after evaluating what is it that we need to feel well is this question, answering this question of, well, how does our current environment impact our ability to meet these vital human needs? And in my most recent book, Hungry, I'm really looking at the impact of the digital age on our core human needs. So evaluating what is the impact of 24/7 news, email, social media, because a lot of these technological innovations have actually made us more miserable. We've created these technologies thinking we're making things more efficient, more fun. In reality, it's been making us more depressed, more stressed out, more lonely. And so Hungry is really going through step by step how the digital age is poorly influencing our well-being, and how that is in turn showing up in the way people spend their time and money, particularly on food. Next slide, please. And so really prior to the pandemic, these were the core trends that were coming to the surface. And this is a very, very small snapshot, but under control and anxiety, right? People were trying to mitigate their rising levels of anxiety by looking for foods that were transparent, that had simple ingredients, words that like natural, which don't actually mean anything, but they cued to people that this was something that was safe, that it had ingredients that they could trust. There's been a huge rise in free from, think of all of the restrictive diets of the last decade, soy-free, GMO-free, sugar-free, paleo, Whole30, I could go on and on, gluten-free is the big one. But really people trying to gain a sense of order and control in their life by, at the very least, understanding what it is that they're putting in their bodies. Then we have community and loneliness. So contrary to common belief, actually the rise in social media has correlated with a rise in loneliness. That's for a lot of reasons that I would need more than 20 minutes to talk through. But in response, you've seen a rising interest in shared meals, communal tables. Think of all of the restaurants that suddenly were tapas style in, the 2010s. Everyone wanted to share a table with people, even if they were strangers, share their plates with the people who they were eating with. Also an interest in boutique experiences, especially boutique gyms. Kind of those big box house gyms were no longer in demand. People wanted to see the same people every week in their workout classes, particularly in these bigger cities. But then you also had a rise in influencer culture. People really looking to affiliate with someone else, even if they didn't know them in person. Also a desire for likes. And then we had purpose rising to the surface. So again, contrary to what people would assume, the rise of the digital age, we also had the rise of the DIY movement and an interest in things like sourdough, gardening, people wanting to really dig their hands in and get dirty. And this really has to do with the fact that many of us are not satisfied by spending a day looking at a screen with the only kind of touch that we're feeling is on our fingertips. And so you were seeing a drive towards also sustainable goods, people wanting to feel like they were making a bigger difference through their purchasing because they might not feel like they're doing that in their day-to-day jobs. Next slide, please. And I do believe someone is unmuted if everyone can mute their lines. So food, as I have found, has become a coping mechanism, a way to feed all of our well-being needs. What this means is people are looking to food culture to fulfill their desire for control, to fulfill their desire for community, to fulfill their desire for purpose and meaning. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the pandemic has amplified a lot of these existing trends. So in Hungry, I'm looking at the digital age. It's been fascinating since 2020 to really be evaluating what's happening in food and lifestyle culture, and also how these core human needs are being really further attacked, right? It's been harder and harder for us to meet some of these most basic needs during this period of time. And that has shown up in the way people choose to spend their discretionary time and income. Next slide, please. And so what has this looked like post 2020? Well, for control, right, I started with hoarding. That was the big one at the very beginning of the pandemic. Also comfort foods, people really wanting to get a sense of control and safety in their lives, sometimes by eating mac and cheese. Data Essential has some really interesting data about the top food trends at the beginning of the pandemic. But there's also been a drive towards immune boosting foods, plant-based foods, people really trying to gain control of their health. Then people have been searching for community in whatever ways they can. Oftentimes that's been through local farm shares. Demand for CSAs has been sky high. It's also been through a food sovereignty movement, which kind of correlates with the Black Lives Matter movement. A growing interest in indigenous communities and indigenous crops, ways of cooking, And then it's also been through things like TikTok and virtual classes, people finding their virtual communities in whatever way they can. And then purpose. People have really wanted to feel like they are making a difference. Again, that can mean just for their families, but there's been a rising interest in victory gardens. There was actually a run on baby chicks at the beginning of the pandemic. I think that's both a desire for control, wanting to feel like you have a source of your food, and then also a sense of meaning, raising an animal, right? Pets was a big part of this movement. But you've also seen a rising interest in things like regenerative foods, carbon negative foods. Next slide, please. Now, many of these trends directly connect to sustainability, yet sustainable foods are not as popular as you would think. Next slide, please. Now, that said, this is another original piece of data from Food for Climate League. We ran a survey with Data Central, actually pretty close to the beginning of the pandemic, in the fall of 2020. And what we found is that 89% of our respondents, who were representative of the US population, 89% say they'd be somewhat or very interested in purchasing and eating foods that help their local communities and farmland become more resilient to climate change. So you kind of have the perfect setup, right? All of our human needs are leading towards sustainable food behaviors, meaning eating things that are transparent, simple ingredients, whole foods that bring us to our communities, that are related to our local environments, that help us get to know our farmers, maybe that connect us with different ways of cooking and heritages, and that potentially are also carbon negative or are helping to restore soil, cover crops, who knows? Next slide, please. But we also have an interest in sustainability. Yet climate smart food culture is super niche. It is not even close to being the norm in the United States. Next slide, please. And here we start to get to a lot of the issues that have already been brought up during today's conversation. So of course, why isn't sustainable food culture the norm? Well, it has to do with a lot of the things that Robert and Michael had talked about, which has to do with really this broken cycle, and I'll be getting a bit into that. But the other problem is also a lot of mistaken assumptions about what it is that people want. There is a mistaken assumption that most people don't care about the climate crisis. That has never been more untrue. Yale actually tracks the public sentiment about the climate crisis. More people are alarmed and concerned now than ever before. I think it's something like 80% of the US population are now falling into that category. Another mistaken assumption is that people don't like plant-forward eating. I hear this often, right? So people will say, oh, well, you know, the sustainable ways of eating are not really popular because everyone just wants to eat steak and potatoes all the time. That's not, in fact, true. Next is that you have to talk about the climate to create sustainable food trends. Also untrue. And what Food for Climate League really focuses on is that oftentimes talking about the climate can spark, it can trigger people emotionally for a number of different reasons. One, it's an apocalyptic, amorphous topic. It also has become politicized, so people think that you're making a political statement when you talk about the climate. And there are ways to guide people towards climate smart behaviors without actually talking about the climate. Next slide, please. This is all connected. And again, we've touched on this a little bit today. But when I say a climate smart food system or a sustainable food system, what I'm talking about is something that's plant forward. Note it, I'm not saying plant-based. I do believe we should be eating meat, but responsibly raised meat, regenerative, zero waste, and then this also should say biodiverse. But all of this can feed into a lot of the other issues that have been brought up today, mainly nutrition, right? If we have a sustainable food system, it also means that you're going to have more foods that are widely available, accessible for people, that can lower those rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease. It can also help bolster farmland resiliency. We're talking about things that can improve soil health, that can also diversify people's business opportunities. Then what I also focus on is well-being. It's going to have a positive impact on people's sense of control, community, and purpose. Again, because a lot of these ways of eating allow us to connect to our heritage, our bodies, our local communities, build skill sets. I could go on. And then it also can help sequester carbon. Food culture is one of the key levers for combating the climate crisis. Next slide, please. But we're caught in this cycle. We have the perfect setup where eaters' wants and needs align with climate smart eating. We have people who say, I really do care about the climate, yet climate smart eating remains niche instead of the norm. So a lot of this has been covered again. Farmers will farm what brings in income. And I saw a lot of people chatting about this. They need to have a reliable income stream. Then food companies are going to make products with great margins, and they're going to make things that people continue to come back for. What does that mean? They're going to be using the low-cost products that are widely available to them, like corn and soy and sugar and salt. And then eaters are going to eat not just based on their values, but based on affordability, accessibility, and what they are addicted to speak to Michael's point. How do we break out of this system to better support farmers and eaters? And here I'm going to pause and just make a few comments based on what we've already heard today. I have a few ideas on how we can break out of this cycle to better support farmers and eaters. And today, the focus really is on the future of farming. The reason why I'm talking about sustainability is because, to me, the future of farming has to be sustainable for a wide variety of reasons. And so we need to be working together and putting our heads together to figure out how can we, what levers do we need to pull in order to create this future for each and every one of us, where farmers are able to still grow on their land, still able to make a great income, but also are feeding eaters foods that are going to contribute to their well-being, both physical and emotional. So I'm going to push back a little bit on a few of the concepts that have been thrown out here today. One is that commodity crop farmers are not benefited by government policy. And also, if I have misheard or anything, feel free, and other panelists I would welcome back into the conversation at this point. But in my experience in speaking with and consulting for large CPG companies, and also spending time with commodity crop and specialty crop farmers, as far as I am aware, specialty crop farmers are bestowed many less benefits from the government, and that growing a diversity of crops, growing cover crops, comes with increased risk and often lower income. Whereas specialty crop farmers are afforded really an insurance policy. And if we are going to break out of this system, if you want food companies to be making different food, they need to have a new supply chain. In order to have a new supply chain, our farmers need to learn to grow new crops, and they need to be able to do so with a mitigation of their own risk. They need to have their own insurance policy if they want to learn to grow new things and a greater diversity of things. I also strongly disagree with the fact that we need to disconnect farmers from food companies. I am all about the power of food culture to change the world. And I believe that instead of creating a divide between farmers and food companies, we actually need more relationships, more innovation, more co-creation between farmers and CPG companies, so that they can create products with rotational crops, with specialty crops. And it can create an immediate insurance policy and income for farmers if those kinds of relationships are being forged. We really need to find farmers who are willing to break out of the corn and soy system, pair them up with food companies that are looking to make those products. I have heard time and time again over the last many years from major CPG companies, well, we want to make X, Y, and Z product, but we can't find anyone to farm it for us. To me, there has to be a direct relationship between these two groups. At Food for Climate League, we help companies strategically position the branding of their climate smart food products. So our entire mission is to democratize climate smart eating. We think that a lot of the climate smart products that are out there are very targeted towards white, wealthy Western audiences. It's actually limiting the potential income of food companies for these climate smart products. But the reality is that food companies are not going to create more of these products without reliable sourcing from farmers. And I often hear these complaints that they can't. The last thing that I wanted to note is on a comment that was made in the Q&A, and this is what happens when I have time, with two other speakers going first. So Robert wrote that the companies, meaning food companies, have little incentive in the marketplace, which is why some government leadership is necessary. I agree 110%, but I don't think that government leadership is the only answer to this. Food for Climate League is working on creating a marketplace demand so that many of eaters' wants and needs can, in fact, be addressed by climate smart eating by making these foods more accessible. Again, we have the wants, the needs, kind of the consumer mindset that's perfectly teed up for this. Yet, we're still caught in this cycle. right? And so we need the eaters to have the demand. We need to make this more appealing to more people, so they put pressure on the food companies, who can then work with farmers and create a new system. I'm going to stop there. I do have to run in 15 minutes, but I welcome any questions in the meantime. Thank you all for being a great audience. If you'd like to learn any more about my work, you can go to eveturopal.com or foodforclimateleague.org. You can also learn more about my book at thehungrybook.com. Because I do have to run early also, please feel free to contact me through any one of those websites or directly through my email, which I will put in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eve. You've raised a number of issues here. I want to quickly, before you have to leave, give an opportunity for some responses from your fellow panelists on your last few comments here, because I do think you've narrowed in on a very important set of issues. Before I turn it over, I think Dr. Paarlberg will want to respond to your issues that you've raised. I just want to ask you, I'm just asking as a general question. My family farm in Indiana on the banks of the Wabash, it's corn and soybeans, let's be honest. What you're suggesting is that we should be growing blueberries and raspberries. And is that what you're suggesting, that somehow if there wasn't these price supports, which our farm does not take, we should be producing something else? And I'm not quite sure we can produce blueberries and raspberries.
Well, right, the beginning of corn and soy was really coming about in World War II, right? That was at the urgency of government leaders. And they provided training and the programs and the fertilizers that were necessary in order to create that kind of food system. Well, that's not the food system that we need anymore. And the reality is that corn and soy are not the only things that would grow on your land. And I would assume that there are other farmers around you who have figured out how to farm differently. Now, I'm not an expert on your land. I also don't think that we're going to move all corn and soy farming away. That's not my suggestion. But there are plenty of farmers who are interested in farming something else, who have the land, who have the environment available to them. But changing what they grow, right, would require new training. It would require new technology, and it would be taking on a huge amount of risk. They don't have
a lot of new equipment, a lot of new types of equipment, a lot of investment. Dr.
Paarlberg, more labor too.
Yeah, before Eve has to leave, Dr. Paarlberg, I assume you want to respond to some of her comments.
Well, yeah, we'll do a little more corn and soy talk here. One thing we need to remember is that the large quantities of corn and soybeans grown in the United States do not all enter the United States food supply. I mentioned already a third of the corn is taken out of the food supply completely and used for ethanol. Another significant portion is exported for use abroad, mostly as animal feed. I think we export more than half of our soybeans. Yes, we grow a lot of corn and soy, but that does not determine the American diet. We may not grow as many fruits and vegetables as we should consume, but we're able to import those things during seasons of the year when they simply cannot be grown affordably here in the United States. I mean, I like the fact that we're a part of a global food system. Back in 1990, we imported about 10% of the food that we consumed. Now we're importing closer to 20%. And most of those imports, as I mentioned earlier, are healthy products, lots of seafood, lots of vegetables, off season from the Southern Hemisphere, lots of tropical fruits. I think it would be a mistake to try to convert American agriculture into a machine to produce what the American consumer should be eating. I sort of like the additional options that international trade provides. and excuse me, and regarding the availability of specialty crops, as I mentioned, USDA data show that per capita availability is much higher than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's at an all-time high. And some of that is dependent on imports. Some of that is dependent upon homegrown production. I don't see the urgency of pushing growers in the United States toward fresh fruits and vegetables and away from corn and soybeans.
Thank you. I know you got to run shortly here, Eve, but I want to try to raise one question across the board here that Michael and Dr. Parberg might want to respond to. In the human truths you mentioned, the desire to feel to be in control, I think was the way you phrased it. Yeah. When it comes to being in control, if I like my Coke or Pepsi or whatever, and I don't, but if I did, I'm in control. Am I giving up my control to a federal agency, the government telling me what I should ingest? Isn't that, if you have a desire to feel in control? Now I'm being hypothetical about this.
Yes.
But aren't you setting up this clash once again between individual freedom decisions versus government control?
I'm actually suggesting that we have more choice. So it's for those who don't necessarily want to be caught in the loop anymore, who want a greater options for them and their families that are accessible, that are affordable. I'm suggesting that they need to have the opportunity to be consuming those foods. I also want to emphasize that a lot of the anxiety that people feel about their food choices today is because they are so disconnected from the food system. I think it's like 98% of Americans don't know a farmer, never been on a farm. And there's a lot of confusion about where our food comes from in the first place.
Right.
And that's in direct antithesis to the way that human beings evolved. We want to know what our food is, what it is that we're putting into our bodies. And so a lot of this also has to do with getting to know the land around us, getting to know the people who are growing the food. Again, I'm not saying that every single farmer should be guided away from corn and soy, but I do think that there are plenty of red flags that are coming right at us right now, that we need to have a more reliable food system here. And I personally think that if you want a pineapple in Chicago in January, you should pay $50 for it. That shouldn't be something that you can get for $3. And I don't think it's right that I'm paying $3 for that. I always think, gosh, I can't imagine what the farmer's making. Yeah. So I think I was brought in here to be the rebel, to really kind of, throw some heat on this fire. I think I was able to do that today. And I also would welcome a follow-up conversation, because I'm also learning in this process.
No, and I think you brought to us exactly what we were hoping. I think we were hoping, because this is going to be debated in the next Farm Bill. There's no question in my mind. All of this is front and center. Let me, I don't know, Michael, let me ask her one last question, but you may want to respond. On organic farming, I would assume then, Eve, I hear a lot from the younger generations, the millennials, about the need organic farming. Yeah. We have a real live experience of something that just this week, in Sri Lanka, the president, when he took over that office, was going to move and said we were going to move to total transition to organic food production countrywide.
Okay.
Rice production dropped 20%. Mm-hmm. Tea yields dropped 40%. Sri Lanka has just had a revolution. He's been thrown out. Food prices, energy prices, a lot of other factors obviously involved here, including the Ukraine situation. But an article this weekend by Boren Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus, says that organic farming is inefficient, land hungry, and very expensive. You want to respond?
Sure. I would say that monoculture is land hungry and is taking all of the nutrients out of the soil and not putting it back to where it needs to be. No, but I mean, without being facetious, I understand that argument. I also am not an advocate that all the food that we need to be eating has to be certified organic. I think there's a lot of issues within kind of the big O organic industry in the United States. I think most eaters don't know exactly what that means. I do think that we have to be farming foods in a way that restores the health of our soils. And I am not opposed to technology to also get us there. I am not anti-GMO. I am not anti-companies like Indigo Ag that are creating probiotics for the land, for the soil. But I also think that demanding that farmers farm in an organic manner, which still, I mean, this is so complicated because saying it's organic also doesn't mean that it's better for the soil. Yeah. But demanding that without proper education, without the proper tools, without the proper support system is absolutely going to drive lower yields. If we have instead a food system that is utilizing cover crops when possible, when it is incentivizing farmers to really grow things in a polyculture way, and we have the food companies that create the products to do that. I have met many farmers who argue that it is possible if done right.
Thank you. Michael, on that issue of human truths and desire for control, to me, your suggestions as it relates to maybe FDA labeling, providing more information, nutrition education, is that the direction? Because I have yet to personally see, even in the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, a la Obamacare, there were new standards set for publishing the amount of calories, say, in the various foods, particularly in the fast foods. I'm yet to see that that's had any impact. How can we, short of what you're suggesting in some ways, is just, and somebody had suggested, wouldn't banning salt eliminate all processed foods?
Yeah, well, it would. Salt is used in half of all foods in supermarket shelves. Fortunately, nobody's talking about banning all salt. And, you know, the FDA adopted its voluntary targets, you know, the specific milligrams per serving that would be appropriate by looking at what is being manufactured now. And there are products that on supermarket shelves that for every of the 150 categories of food that meet the FDA's 10-year goal. And the 10-year goal is to reduce sodium intake by about 1/3. Not 0 milligrams, but if we can get it down by 1/3, that would be a miracle.
Yeah.
So, you know, let's keep things in perspective. And more food companies are replacing some of the sodium with potassium chloride, potassium salt, as opposed to sodium chloride. And it's not quite as salty as salt, but it does enable companies like Campbell to lower the sodium content of its tomato soup by about 1/3. So, you know, I think lowering salt is a relatively easy one. And I think on the Affordable Care Act that mandated calorie disclosures on menus and menu boards of chain restaurants, I don't know if that's had an effect or not. Because what we can't see is that encouraging companies to market lower calorie foods than they otherwise would have. Yeah. And you know, I suspect it's a pretty weak tool, but it does give millions of people the opportunity to lower their calorie intake.
Okay, I want before Eve leaves, stay with us. Just one more question I have for Eve that then Michael and Dr. Perlberg can follow up on after you leave. There's a Bon Appetit. I don't know. It's a magazine. I realize it's a foodie magazine. This month's edition has the future of food in its edition. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it goes out to 2032. It goes to 2052. In fact, it goes along 2042. And I'm going to read to you 2032, what these people said will be the food that we consumed. And I want to get your response, and then Michael's and Dr. Perlberg's. In 2032, within the next decade, grocery stores will stock cell-cultured proteins Stem cells are collected, put into bioreactors, and fed nutrients like glucose so that they grow into animal-free chicken, beef, pork, and even duck, as opposed to the meat alternatives we have today, which are very good imitations made with plant products.
Yeah.
These proteins don't need room to graze and expel methane, don't waste uneaten parts of an animal, and are less likely to contain bacteria like salmonella. This is beyond burger, beyond burger.
Yes, yeah.
Is this the future of food in this country in a decade?
I don't know that it'll be in a decade, but I do think that is on the horizon. And this is on the horizon for a number of reasons. Number one, and I know that this is going to make people squirm, but we can't continue to eat as much meat as we are eating for climate reasons and for human health reasons. That's just a fact. That is also related to why we should also diminish the amount of soy and corn that we produce, because there's going to be less of a marketplace for it if it's not animal feed. But that is just going to be a shift in the marketplace. It's inevitable for a number of reasons. But of course, we have created a global culture that's craving meat, right? You're seeing as people's incomes increase, they want meat because it's also a sign of being elite. You're seeing this happen in China. So really the question is, how do you provide for that eater demand without raising as much cattle as we currently do? And the solutions to that are these processed plant-based meat alternatives. It's also cultured meat. It's also just moving people towards a more plant-forward, whole plant-forward diet. I personally see a future where we are getting our food from a multitude of sources. I personally think that cultured meat is going to become an option for low-income individuals around the world. I think that these whole plant options are unfortunately going to become more of a luxury item for the middle and upper class. And again, there's just not enough time to really go into that. I also think that people are going to be fed both through aquaponic, hydroponic, and land-based specialty crop production.
Thank you. And Eve, thank you very much for taking the time. And no, I wanted to have this stirred up. I think this is the issues. I think these are the things that are going to be debated. Millennials and the new generation, this is your future. We want you to be around, and we want to have sustainable agriculture into the future, which I think you agree with us.
Yes, 100%.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, any thoughts on the future of food out there in terms of going to sell cultured proteins in our grocery stores as opposed to what we have today?
I think it's coming. You know, the industry is a pipsqueak. You know, they don't have any marketable products right now, but the prices are coming down. It's certainly, I don't know what it tastes like. If it tastes like real chicken or beef or duck or fish, or, you know, I think people will buy it if it's about the same price. To think that
is it at the same price? I mean, I checked it out a little bit on the way home from the grocery store last night. I don't think it's competitive, is it today?
Oh no, not now. But you know, it's like solar power, where the costs are coming way down, and it's part of the future. You know, the meat counter is not going to be replaced by 3D printers churning out cultured meat products. But you know, it'll be one element. Organic food will certainly continue to be part of the food supply. But food is something. Food consumption changes so slowly. There's such enormous inertia built into the system that you know, I don't think the cattle industry needs to be worried about being replaced by cultured meat by 2032.
There have been a lot of questions. Some of them, I believe, you and Dr. Parlberg have already answered through the Q&A device here. But it's disappeared on my screen, so I don't know how you responded to that question. But I think Robert Thompson had a question early on as to how you define ultra-processed. I think that was to you, Dr. Parlber. How do you define ultra-processed?
Yes, the definition in widest use was created by an organization in Brazil, I think named NOVA, N-O-V-A, and they have a definition that focuses on substances extracted from seeds, from unprocessed commodities. If it's all extracted from something else, it's ultra processed. I think that's what it comes down to. But that's a good reason to get my book. You can find the exact definition in the book and the provenance of that.
I see it as foods made up of these components of flour, sugar, oil, water, salt, as opposed to foods made of real food. You know, the broccoli, the consumption of which has increased so much. And
let me think about that. I dabble around a little bit with cooking, not very much, but I made because the strawberries are fresh right now, and I love fresh strawberries. A strawberry rhubarb pie. Now when I put that together, I had sugar, I had flour, I had these ingredients. So is that a ultra processed food?
I think that would be labeled an ultra-processed food, notwithstanding the few strawberries you throw in amidst the sugar.
The rhubarb. Well, okay. Listen, yeah. There's a question as it relates to the dairy, and again, I don't know if anybody responded to it or not. But should the dairy farmers who are pushing for whole milk and chocolate milk in the school lunch program, are they doing the right thing there? Or again, should that, back to your issues, Dr. Parlberg, about what the role of our producers should be in setting policy. Is that correct? Should they be doing this?
I don't think they should. I don't think getting chocolate milk into the schools is going to be on balance good for the nutrition of the school children. You have to worry about the fat content. You have to worry about the sugar content. These are drinks the children like, that's for sure. But it's a little too clear to me that the push for chocolate milk in schools is coming more from the dairy industry than from the school nutrition community. It's interesting that this problem became it blew up in the face of the previous Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, who was recorded bragging to school children, I think in Northern Virginia, that drinking chocolate milk is what made him as big as he was. And Michelle Obama came right back and said, can you believe what some people are willing to say to our kids? Yeah. I think that commodity groups are making a mistake when they see the school lunch menu as a political battleground where they have to fight for French fries or fight for chocolate milk. I think that there's a better way for them to get their products to consumers than through the federal school lunch program.
I have a general question for both of you experts. I've done so much work in this area. A new book out called, not competing with your book, Dr. Parlberg, but How the Other Half Eats by Pira Fielding Singh. And she has a comment in here, which I thought is important. She says, diets are affected by family in a broader context, including their neighborhoods, their schools, housing, and jobs. Food access reforms have fallen short of enabling a nutritious diet for all families because they haven't addressed how every one of these contextual factors affects what the food families consume, from where the parents can afford to live to the jobs they have. Fundamentally, all that shapes the food, what food means to families, and in turn, how families eat. I guess what I'm trying to get to here is something in the context of public policy. What we consume is so critical. It's our own self-decisions that we make sometimes, right, correct or wrong. But there are so many other factors that affect the health of the public out there: housing, jobs, childcare, income is critical. I don't want to take anything away from this discussion, but is this a broader issue than just how we label and whether we consume more salt or don't consume more salt or sugar? Isn't this a broad issue about how there are a number of other public policy issues that impact diets out there besides just farmers?
Yeah, totally. This is and you can, go to continue taking this to the Electoral College and the Senate. Should Wyoming have as much representation as California? Which obviously affects everything else you mentioned, income, housing, and so on. Trans fat, as I said, was an easy one. And let's pick that low-hanging fruit where we can. And nobody's mentioned convenience, but I think that's an enormous factor, and it relates to you mentioned time, how much time availability people have.
Time availability, right.
Convenience is also related to sloth. To prepare rhubarb pies and other home-cooked foods takes an effort. You got to think. It is so much easier to grab a product off a shelf than to have to think about a recipe and execute the recipe.
I have a couple of last minute questions here. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to get to everybody's questions that they've sent in. We'll try to get those, I believe, through the Farm Foundation, if we can get to the authors. Eve's gone. Eve's not here, but I want to take up her cause on the issue of climate. Again, John Doerr, who's a leading author, in fact, is #1 New York Speed and Scale, just put out a book called Speed and Scale. And he has a table in here that struck me about the emissions of kilograms of food, and way off the charts. And I put this up, it'll probably, but the big red line on the top is beef herd. Second is lamb and mutton, cheese, beef dairy, dark chocolate, coffee. But the one that's off the map here in terms of emissions of kilograms of food is beef. You proposed, I think, Michael, that somehow we tax cattle, high-fat cattle. I'm not sure that gets to the emissions issue that John Doerr and, by the way, Bill Gates and others have suggested should be addressed. Mm-hmm. Tell me how this is going to play out in the next farm bill when it comes, because climate will be front and center, I am sure.
Well, I think the cattle industry will be front and center also, fighting off every initiative to affect the prices and consumption of beef. But you're right, it is beef is such a huge contributor to climate change. And the measure I proposed of getting leaner cattle won't really affect the climate.
Won't affect that, right.
Right. We need other things like cultured meat products, veggie burgers. Could you imagine when you were growing up that there would be veggie burgers at Burger King? It's, our society is changing, and those millennials and so on are certainly much more excited about vegetarian diets and regenerative agriculture than we ever were. And they're concerned about climate, more concerned about climate change. It wasn't an issue when we were growing up.
By the way, Bagona has a good question. Is a burger made from vegetable protein, additives, artificial flavors, an example of an ultra-processed food?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
It's questionable how much healthier typical veggie burgers are than regular beef burgers, but they're certainly a lot better for the environment.
Yeah, I would emphasize that too. If you compare a plant-based imitation burger to a real beef burger, the burden on the climate is about 90% less for the plant-based imitation product. And I think that I doubt that we're going to be taxing meat anytime soon. I once saw a list of things that we're willing to tax in the United States, and it's a pretty long list, but meat is not one of them. And this is in some ways surprising because meat consumption in the United States is 5 times as high today as it was in 1940. It compromises the environment. It compromises human health. You'd think that we'd be looking for ways to constrain meat consumption, but we're not able to use the tax instrument. My guess is that substituting healthier meats for less healthy meats, we've done some of that already. Per capita beef consumption in the United States actually peaked in 1976. It's down considerably since then. We're eating more pork and poultry and less beef. But substituting plant-based and maybe even cell-grown products for animal-based products is, I think, a big part of the future. We had this discussion earlier. Right now, plant-based imitation meats are only 2.75% of total retail meat sales in the United States, which is pretty small. But Bloomberg Intelligence is saying that that's going to increase 450% over the next decade, and then it will continue to increase. It's not the solution, but it's a component of a solution to the problem that Michael pointed out.
There are lots of factors involved in this, but of course, this morning, the Department of Labor issued its CPI for the month of April, and I'm just looking at meats. Meats, poultry, fish, and eggs over the last year have grown by nearly 20% of the price of meat, poultry, fish, and eggs. And of that, about 15% of it was the increase in beef. So maybe the market itself will, with those kinds of prices, will cut back on consumption in those particular areas. But I was always taught that food was somewhat of an inelastic, the economists say, an inelastic demand. You still got to eat, and there are not a lot of substitutes, but maybe these substitutions we're talking about for better will be better. I will also say that fresh fruits and vegetables are up substantially. So when we're trying to encourage that, it's kind of difficult when those prices are going up also. Listen, I have one last question, and then I'll turn it back to the Farm Foundation. I'm a novice in this area, but boy, I tell you, labels. I see USDA organic, real organic. There's something called Demeter Certified Biodynamic, Regenerative Organic Certified, Land to Market, Certified. Isn't this confusing the American public about all these labels? I'm all for information, but boy, this is confusing.
Yeah, the companies are using these labels for a reason. They think it will increase the appeal of their product. Whether it's communicating something of scientific or nutritional significance is another question. What interests me about the organic sector is that it really isn't growing that fast after decades of a national organic program. Certified organic cropland is still less than 1% of total harvested cropland in the United States. And the reason, the number one reason is the organic rule does not allow farmers to use any synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And most farmers just don't want to do without such a critical component of modern productivity in the farm sector.
Of course, I think the price of nitrogen as fertilizers has escalated almost double or 3 times over the last year, so that will slow that down too. Listen, I appreciate Michael, Robert, Eve has left us, but interesting discussion. This is going to be I think this is going to be a fascinating farm bill, if nothing else, for us policy wonks to watch as we get into next year. And so with that, Martha, I'm going to turn it back to you and leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all of our speakers for the insightful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions, keeping that dialogue going. We appreciate your engagement with us, and we would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey you will see at the conclusion of this forum. If you'd like to help us continue providing valuable programming such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities. And we are so grateful for your support. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.